In this episode, we're going to turn external scanning from a stressful compliance hurdle into a clear, repeatable practice that actually improves security instead of just generating anxiety. When people talk about ASV scans, they often focus on the final result, pass or fail, as if the scan is a grade you receive rather than a signal you learn from. The truth is that external scanning is one of the simplest ways to spot obvious exposure before an attacker does, but it only works well when you understand what it is measuring and how your environment affects the outcome. Brand new learners sometimes assume a scan is the same thing as a penetration test, but it is not, and treating it like one leads to confusion and unrealistic expectations. The real goal here is to execute scans in a way that produces consistent results, avoids last-minute surprises, and leaves behind evidence that the process is controlled. When you approach scanning with calm discipline, passing becomes normal, and value becomes the reason you keep doing it. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To begin, you need a clean definition of what we are talking about, because precise language prevents most misunderstandings. An approved scanning vendor, ASV, is a provider authorized to perform certain external vulnerability scans used in validation activities. The word external matters because these scans look at what is visible from outside, the way an attacker would see your internet-facing systems. These scans are not trying to prove that every weakness is gone, and they are not trying to simulate a human attacker chaining exploits together. Instead, they are focused on identifying known vulnerabilities and insecure conditions that can be detected through automated methods. Beginners often think an external scan is a complete security assessment, but it is more accurate to think of it as a recurring health check for exposure that should never be present in a well-managed environment. When you see it as a health check, you naturally build routines that keep results stable rather than lurching from crisis to crisis. Now it helps to connect this to why the scanning requirement exists in the first place, because the purpose explains the expectations. Internet-facing systems are a common entry point for attacks because they must accept traffic from unknown users, which means they are constantly probed by automated tools. If a system has a known vulnerability, attackers can often exploit it at scale, sometimes within hours of public disclosure, because scanning the internet is easy and cheap for them. External scans exist to force a regular spotlight onto this risk, so organizations do not unintentionally leave dangerous weaknesses exposed. In a payment environment, an exposed weakness can become a pathway into systems that ultimately touch sensitive data or a platform for redirecting customers, stealing credentials, or disrupting service. The scan requirement also creates a consistent baseline across organizations, because it is not enough to say you patch regularly. You need to show that what is actually exposed is acceptably hardened. When you understand that goal, you stop treating scan failures as personal insults and start treating them as signals to correct visible exposure. The next key concept is scope, because most scan confusion is really scope confusion that shows up later as a surprise. External scanning is typically focused on internet-facing assets that are in scope for the environment being validated, meaning the systems that support or connect to the cardholder data environment. If an organization does not maintain an accurate inventory of public-facing addresses, domains, and systems, it is easy to miss assets or to include assets that should not be included. Both mistakes create pain, because missing assets creates hidden risk, and including the wrong assets creates endless false alarms and wasted effort. Beginners often assume someone else knows the full list, but in real organizations, public exposure can grow through marketing sites, temporary test systems, forgotten subdomains, or vendor-managed platforms. Executing scans that pass starts with knowing exactly what is being scanned and why it belongs in the scan set. When the scope is clean and stable, scanning becomes routine instead of chaotic. A common beginner misunderstanding is the belief that you can simply run a scan, fix what it finds, and then you are done for the year. In reality, scanning is recurring because your environment is changing and the vulnerability landscape is changing, even if you do nothing on purpose. New vulnerabilities are discovered in widely used software, and scanning tools learn to detect them, which means yesterday's clean result can become tomorrow's failure without any code change on your side. You also deploy updates, rotate infrastructure, add new services, and change configurations, and each change can create a new exposure. The value of scanning is not that it gives you a permanent certificate of safety. Its value is that it helps you continuously confirm that external exposure remains under control. Executing scans that pass means building a process that anticipates change, checks exposure regularly, and treats scan results as part of normal operations. When you adopt that approach, the scan becomes a predictable checkpoint instead of a recurring emergency. To execute scans effectively, you need to know what a scan result is actually telling you at a high level, because that shapes how you respond. A scan is typically reporting vulnerabilities and configuration findings based on what it can observe, such as service banners, response behavior, and known signatures of weaknesses. Some findings are about software versions that are known to be vulnerable, while others are about insecure protocol support or misconfigurations that create unnecessary risk. A scan can also surface issues like weak encryption settings, unexpected open ports, or services that should not be reachable from the internet. Beginners sometimes read scan findings as if they are all equally severe and equally certain, but findings vary in confidence and impact. The goal is not to argue with the scanner emotionally, but to interpret findings calmly and decide whether the issue is real, whether it is in scope, and what control or remediation addresses it. When you treat scan output as structured information, you can build a repeatable triage process that prevents panic and speeds resolution. A major reason scans fail, even in otherwise well-run environments, is patching and remediation timing that is not aligned with scan cadence. If you patch irregularly, or only when something breaks, scan results will reflect that inconsistency. A stable program typically has a rhythm where vulnerabilities are identified, prioritized, remediated, and then verified, with clear ownership for each step. Beginners sometimes assume remediation means installing patches and moving on, but verification is what prevents repeat failures and lingering exposure. Verification can include confirming that the vulnerable component is truly updated, that the service restarted, that the vulnerable port is no longer exposed, and that the scanner's observation point now sees a hardened posture. This is why executing scans that pass is not primarily a scanning skill. It is an operational discipline skill. When remediation and verification are part of routine maintenance, scanning simply reflects that health rather than exposing neglected work. Another common failure pattern involves assets that are not managed with the same discipline as primary systems, such as cloud-hosted marketing pages, vendor-managed portals, or legacy systems kept alive for convenience. These systems often slip outside normal patching and monitoring processes, yet they remain publicly reachable, which makes them attractive targets and frequent scan failures. Executing scans that pass means treating every internet-facing asset as a high accountability system, even if it feels peripheral to the core business. You need owners for each asset, expectations for patching and configuration, and a clear plan for retirement when the asset is no longer needed. Beginners often think security failures come from advanced hacking, but many real failures come from neglected systems that were never brought into the program's routine. When you bring those systems into the same lifecycle discipline as everything else, scan results become far more consistent and the overall security posture improves. False positives and ambiguous findings are another area that can create frustration if you do not have a calm method for handling them. Automated scanning cannot perfectly understand every custom application or unusual configuration, so sometimes it flags a condition that looks risky but is actually mitigated by context. The danger is that teams can fall into two equally harmful habits, either accepting every finding as unquestionable truth or dismissing findings as scanner noise. A better approach is to validate findings with evidence, which might include confirming the actual version of software in use, reviewing configuration settings, or checking whether the exposed service truly supports an insecure option. When a finding is truly a false positive, it should be documented and managed so it does not become a recurring distraction, and if possible, the environment can be adjusted to reduce confusing signals. Executing scans that provide value means you do not waste time arguing with the tool, but you also do not blindly accept output without verification. That balance is what turns scanning into an efficient process rather than an endless debate. Encryption and protocol configuration frequently appear in external scan results, and they are a good example of how scanning connects to broader security principles. An internet-facing service might support older protocols or weak cipher configurations that are considered unacceptable because they can allow interception or downgrade behaviors. Beginners often think encryption is either on or off, but in practice there are settings that determine which protocols are allowed, which options are negotiated, and whether insecure legacy support remains enabled for compatibility. When scans identify weak configurations, remediation is often less about patching and more about tightening settings to align with modern expectations. The value here is that scanning forces you to keep your external posture current, because internet-facing encryption expectations evolve over time. Executing scans that pass means periodically reviewing these settings and ensuring your infrastructure templates and deployment standards keep pace. When you treat protocol hygiene as routine maintenance, scan results become far less surprising and your external exposure becomes more resilient. Evidence and documentation are part of executing scans that pass, not because paperwork is the goal, but because proof reduces confusion and speeds decision-making. You want to know when scans were performed, what assets were included, what results were produced, and how findings were addressed. You also want to capture the logic behind scope decisions so changes do not create accidental gaps or accidental expansion. Beginners sometimes think documentation is only for auditors, but good records are also for your future self, because the next scan cycle will arrive and you will want to remember what happened last time. Documentation also helps when teams change, because continuity prevents the program from resetting to guesswork whenever a person leaves. When you have clear evidence trails, scan remediation becomes a controlled workflow rather than a frantic hunt. That control is what makes passing normal and what makes the scan process sustainable across months and years. It is also important to connect scanning to change management, because many scan failures are introduced by changes that were not reviewed with external exposure in mind. A new system is deployed with a default security group, a temporary test port is left open, a new subdomain is created without hardening, or a vendor integration exposes an administrative interface to the public internet. These changes can be completely unintentional, yet they change what the scanner sees immediately. Executing scans that pass means building a habit where any change that affects internet-facing services triggers a security review that considers scan impact. This does not require heavy bureaucracy, but it does require awareness that external exposure is sensitive and must be controlled. Beginners often see scanning as something you do after systems exist, but the best outcomes happen when you design and deploy systems in a way that anticipates scanning requirements from the start. When change management and scanning reinforce each other, surprises become rare. Another valuable teaching beat is how to think about prioritization when scan results include multiple findings, because triage is where good programs differentiate themselves. High-severity issues that provide obvious exploit paths on public services deserve immediate focus, especially those affecting authentication, remote access, or widely exploited software. Lower-severity issues might still need remediation, but they can be scheduled in a way that aligns with maintenance windows and operational impact. Beginners sometimes either freeze because everything looks urgent or they downplay issues because the list feels too large. A disciplined approach focuses first on what most directly increases the chance of compromise, and then works down the list with clear ownership and timelines. Providing value means you do not just chase a pass label. You use the scan to drive real risk reduction. When you consistently remediate what matters most, the environment becomes safer and the scan result naturally follows that improvement. Scans also provide value when you use them as a feedback loop for systemic improvement, not merely as a repeated firefight. If the same type of finding appears repeatedly, that is a signal that your patching process, configuration baseline, or deployment templates need improvement. For example, if new systems consistently show the same insecure protocol setting, that suggests your standard build process includes that weakness. Fixing the template prevents future repetition, which saves time and reduces risk. Beginners often treat scan findings as isolated tasks, but mature programs look for patterns and root causes. That mindset transforms scanning from a recurring burden into a driver of continuous improvement. When you improve the underlying system, scan results stabilize and operational effort decreases over time. Executing scans that pass and provide value is ultimately about learning and reinforcing better defaults. As we bring everything together, executing ASV scans that pass and provide value becomes a story about clarity, discipline, and evidence rather than about chasing a score. You start with a precise understanding of what external scans are and what they are not, and you build a clean scope that matches real public exposure. You interpret results thoughtfully, verify findings with evidence, and remediate with a consistent patching and configuration process that includes verification. You bring all internet-facing assets into the same operational routine so neglected systems do not become recurring failures. You treat encryption and protocol hygiene as ongoing maintenance, and you protect the integrity of the scan process with good documentation and change management. You prioritize based on real risk and use repeated findings as signals for systemic improvement. When you operate this way, scans become predictable checkpoints that confirm healthy external posture, and passing becomes the natural byproduct of a program that is truly under control.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.